Hi, everyone. It's Maria, and welcome to the Breaking Up with Toxicity podcast. Thank you for being with me today. Each week, I will connect with people as they share relatable life experiences. We will talk about and at times challenge reoccurring unhealthy and toxic patterns that keep you from the changes you want to see as you break these unhealthy cycles. So let's get started and see where this show will take us today. Be sure to listen and don't forget to follow so that you never miss an episode. Welcome to Breaking Up with Toxicity, where we explore unhealthy relationship patterns, dysfunctional emotional systems, communication breakdowns, personality patterns, and the psychological dynamics that shape how we live, love, and we relate to others. The goal of this podcast is not to label people, it's to build awareness, insight, and self-understanding so that individuals can recognize patterns, break unhealthy cycles, and create healthier emotional systems moving forward. Today, we're talking about something that many people feel deeply but often struggle to name, and that is the long-term emotional impact of being raised by a narcissistic mother and how those experiences shape daughters, sons, and the relationships they later built in adulthood. This episode is not about blaming mothers, it's about understanding emotional systems, because many parents repeat patterns they themselves learn. But when we don't understand the emotional blueprint that we were raised in, we actually unknowingly repeat it. And that happens in friendships, romantic relationships, parenting, and even in the way we treat ourselves. And one of the most important things that people don't realize is this: narcissistic maternal dynamics often affect daughters and sons very differently. The roles they are assigned, the emotional expectation that's placed onto them, and the way love and approval are given create a very different developmental pathways. So today we're going to talk about what these dynamics actually look like, what often happens between mothers and daughters, what happens between mothers and sons, how this shows up later in adult relationships, and the awareness that's needed to begin breaking these cycles. Now, to keep things grounded and easy to follow, I'm going to move through this in clear sections. First is the bigger developmental context, how these patterns can form. Then we're going to talk about what these dynamics often look like inside real homes. And then after that, we'll break down how the mother-daughter pathway often develops, how the mother-son pathway often develops. And then we'll bridge it all into what these patterns tend to look like in adult relationships. So with that in mind, let's get into it. When we talk about narcissistic maternal patterns, one of the most important things to understand is that these patterns rarely appear suddenly in adulthood. They usually develop over time through a combination of psychological, environmental, relational, and developmental factors. There is no single origin to this story. Instead, it is often the interaction of several experiences that shapes how someone learns to relate to themselves and to others. One pathway begins in emotionally deprived childhood environments. So, a child who grows up without consistent emotional validation, safety, or actually a stable attachment may learn very early that vulnerability does not lead to comfort. It leads to dismissal, shame, or unpredictability. Instead of learning how to regulate emotions internally, this child may learn to regulate externally by seeking admiration, control, or reassurance from others. And then what happens is over time, these external validation becomes the primary way that this person learns how to stabilize emotionally. When that child later becomes a parent, the same external regulation strategies can continue. So sometimes appearing as control, emotional self-focus, or difficulty tolerating a child's independence. Another pathway involves chronic instability, or let's say survival-based environments. In homes where it felt like a lot of chaos, financial instability, unpredictable caregivers, maybe even addiction, violence, or frequent emotional upheaval. Control often becomes a psychological survival strategy. When someone grows up believing that safety depends on controlling the outcomes, they may later try to control their children's behavior, image, decisions, or emotional responses, not always because of conscious intent, but because unpredictability unconsciously triggers their anxiety. Attachment development also plays a significant role. So, individuals who develop insecure attachment patterns, whether anxious, avoidant, or disorganized, they may struggle to experience closeness without fear of abandonment or loss of control. A parent with anxious attachment may experience a child's independence as emotional rejection and respond by tightening control and increasing guilt messaging to them or demanding loyalty. A parent with avoidant attachment may struggle to tolerate emotional vulnerability and actually may respond to emotional distancing, criticism, or invalidation when the child expresses their needs. These attachment based responses often are automatic rather than intentional, yet they do shape the relational environment that the child grows up in. There are also intergenerational transmission patterns. Parenting models are often learned, not invented. If someone was raised in a home where emotional hierarchy, obedience, or image managed were emphasized, those patterns may feel very normal or even actually very necessary. Without exposure to alternative relational models, these individuals often replicate the emotional systems that they were taught. This is normal for them, even when those systems cause them pain. Now we have the cultural and social reinforcement. That can further strengthen these dynamics. In some culture systems, strong emphasis is placed on family reputation, obedience to authority, and parental sacrifice narratives, right? Or very rigid gender roles. When these values combined with unresolved emotional insecurity, they can create environments where control is normalized and emotional autonomy is actually discouraged. This does not mean that culture creates narcissism. Please remember that. But it can influence how certain behaviors are justified, protected, and even left unchallenged. Understanding these developmental pathways does not excuse harmful relational behavior, but it does help explain why these patterns can run so deeply ingrained and why they often repeat across generations when they are not consciously addressed. At the same time, it's essential to remember that not everyone who experiences trauma or an unstable environment or insecure attachment becomes a narcissistic parent. Please, that's what social media's narrative is. Many individuals with difficult childhoods develop deep empathy, emotional insight, and they're highly attuned parenting styles. They have protective factors, supportive relationships, therapy, self reflection, and then emotional education and safe attachment experiences actually later in life. That can interrupt the unhealthy patterns from what they experienced. So, when we explore narcissistic maternal dynamics, we're not looking for a single cause. That's impossible. We are looking at a network of influences: developmental, relational, psychological, and environmental, that together shape how someone learns to give love, to receive love, and to manage emotional connection. And understanding this helps us see two truths at the same time. These patterns often come from somewhere and they still can cause real emotional harm. Now, because this word gets used loosely, one more clarification, and I want to be careful clinically and accurately here. What is required for a diagnosis of narcissistic personality disorder? To understand the difference between narcissistic traits and a diagnosable personality disorder is actually identified clinically. A formal diagnosis is never made based on one behavior, one relationship conflict, or someone being self centered during stress. Clinicians need to look for a long standing pattern beginning by early adulthood, and it has to be present across many relationships and life areas and causing meaningful relational or functional impairment. So, specifically, narcissistic personality disorder involves a consistent pattern of grandiosity, the need for admiration, a difficulty with empathy, and this is expressed through multiple behavior traits that appear repeatedly over time. Clinically, an individual must show several of the following patterns, not just one: a persistent self of exaggerated self importance, which is often overestimating achievements or expecting recognition without proportional accomplishments. A strong preoccupation with fantasies of unlimited success, power, brilliance, beauty, or even ideal love, and a belief that they are uniquely special and should associate only with people or institutions that are perceived as high status or exceptional. A constant need for excessive admiration, reassurance, or validation to maintain that self image. There's a sense of entitlement, expecting special treatment or automatic compliance from others without considering it be reciprocal. Patterns of exploiting relationships, using others primarily just to achieve personal goals or to maintain their emotional stability. They have difficulty recognizing or generally responding to the emotional needs, perspectives, or experiences of others. So it's often described as impaired empathy and frequent envy of others or the belief that others are envious of them. They regularly display of arrogance, dismissiveness, or condescending attitude in interpersonal interactions. So, for a diagnosis, these traits must be enduring, inflexible, and present across multiple life domains, not with only one family relationship, one stressful period, or even one situational conflict. This distinction matters because many individuals may show narcissistic traits at times: defensiveness, self focus, or difficulty handling criticism, especially during stress, trauma, or emotional overwhelm. Traits alone do not equal a personality disorder. A diagnosis reflects a deeply ingrained relational style that consistently shapes how a person does interact across most areas of their life. Understanding this helps people move away from trying to determine whether somebody technically qualifies for a diagnosis and instead focus on the more meaningful question: what were the relational patterns I experienced, and how did those patterns shape me? Because healing does not require proving someone else meets a diagnostic criteria. Healing actually begins when the relational impact is understood. So, what do these dynamics often look like? So, in homes where narcissistic relational patterns exist, love often becomes tied, right? Sometimes subtly, to performance, obedience, loyalty, or even emotional compliance. So a child may learn that approval feels safe while disagreement of independence feels emotionally risky. Children in these environments often hear statements like, "Don't embarrass me. You're too sensitive. After everything that I've done for you, why can't you be more like?" Sometimes praise is public while the criticism is private. Sometimes the child becomes responsible for comforting the parent emotionally. Sometimes independence is interpreted as rejection. Over time, the child stops asking, "What do I feel?" and instead begins asking, "What do I need to do to remain accepted?" This becomes the beginning of an emotional blueprint, actually, that shapes identity and relational expectations long into adulthood. Another important layer: how does a mother ever become like this? We cannot know someone's history without hearing it directly, and we cannot diagnose or explain a whole person through a podcast. So, what I'm going to say here is context, not certainty. Some mothers developed these patterns because they grew up emotionally deprived or shamed, where love was conditioned and vulnerability wasn't safe. Some grew up in instability and learned that control equals safety. Some carry unresolved trauma and regulate their emotions through external validation. Some never developed internal emotional identity, so they rely on admiration, obedience, or control to feel stable. And culture can absolutely reinforce this. If someone grew up in a system where respect meant obedience, where image mattered more than emotional truth, where children were expected to be extensions of the parent, those environments can protect the pattern and normalize it. Understanding the origin can create compassion and clarity, but I want to be very direct. Understanding why it happened is not the same as accepting it. You can understand the context and still set a boundary. Now, let's talk about how this often shows up differently and depending on the child, because narcissistic maternal dynamics tend to shape daughters and sons in distinct ways. Before we close, here's what today's conversation was really about: Today, we focused on the blueprint, how early emotional environments, attachment experiences, family systems, and intergenerational patterns can shape the way people learn to give love, receive love, manage conflict, and understand themselves long before they ever enter adult relationships. Because many of the patterns people struggle with later in life did not begin in adulthood. They began as adaptations that once helped them maintain connection, safety, or stability within their families. Understanding the blueprint is not about blaming parents or labeling families. It's about awareness, recognizing which patterns were learned, which roles were adaptive at the time, and which ones may no longer fit the life and relationships that you are trying to build today. This episode is part one of Narcissistic Mother Blueprint Series. In the next episodes, we will move deeper into how these patterns play out in real life, first exploring the mother-daughter dynamic, and then the mother-son dynamic, each of which develops differently and deserves its own conversation. We'll also talk about how these early relational roles continue showing up in adult relationships, boundaries, emotional decision making, and the process of breaking cycles that may have existed across generations. If this episode gave you the language for something you've felt but couldn't quite explain, share it with someone who may need that same clarity. Awareness is not the end of the process, it is the beginning of change. This is Breaking Up with Toxicity. I'm Maria Shkreli, and I'll see you in part two.